Okay, everyone. So I think better make a start because we've got quite a lot to get through. So my name's James Russell. I'm the lead designer for the Total War series at Creative Assembly. Now, before we start, I'm interested to know, could you raise your hands if you're actually a practicing game designer? Wow, that's almost everybody. That's quite intimidating. Okay. So yeah, the guys have asked me to just remind you a couple of things. If you could turn your cell phones off, and also if you could make sure you fill out your evaluation forms, but please only do that if you really enjoy the talk. Very important. So in my talk today, I want to explore our approach to design and how we think about constructing gameplay. Now, of course, this is the daily work of game designers across the world, but hopefully sharing our experiences with some of these design problems that we've encountered can yield some useful insights for you to take away. And later on in the session, I'm actually going to announce a brand new Total War game, something very different from anything we've done before, and I'll talk to you about some of the challenges we've had there. But to begin at the beginning, for anybody not super familiar with the Total War series, Total War games are made up of two distinct elements. So the first is a grand-scale empire-building strategy game, the campaign map. Now, it's turn-based, and it's set in a particular historical era. Now, in many ways, there's a similarity with 4X games like Civilization. So you can recruit armies, develop your cities, build and defend trade routes, conduct diplomacy and research technology, and manage your empire and its politics. So it's a big game. But the key difference, the defining feature of Total War, is that when two armies clash on this campaign map, you go down and you fight the battle yourself in our real-time 3D battle engine. So that's the second element. We have this real-time tactical game that portrays massed historical battles on a really epic scale with thousands upon thousands of soldiers at your command. And you can actually zoom right down and see these individuals really close up, fighting their guts out for you. And the combat system actually works at a man level so that every projectile, every arrow, every sword hit is fully resolved for each individual across all of these thousands of men. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the implications of that later on. So our latest titles are Shogun 2 and its expansion, and Rome 2, which is what we're working on right now, due for release later this year. So just to start, I'll give you a very quick look at what these games look like in action. And here we need the audio. Which we don't have. The point is, you can see what's going on, right? This is the combination of the campaign and the battle gameplay. This is Shogun 2. So we've got naval battles and land battles. And Rome 2 is our latest title that's in development. And this is a particular demo battle, the Battle of Teutoburg. It really needs the audio, doesn't it? Okay, so I think you can see it's quite an impressive visual spectacle, really. Certainly on the battle side. So the origins of the Total War series lie back in the late 90s with the idea to create a new kind of strategy war game that could portray realistic mass battles on a truly epic scale that no other game had done before. And following on from the success of original Shogun, the series has moved on, gone from strength to strength, portraying many different historical eras. And of course, this all leads up to our latest title, Rome 2. Now, the Total War engine has been featured in various TV shows along the way. So we've had Time Commanders on the BBC and Decisive Battles, a documentary series on the History Channel. And we sell quite a lot of units for a PC-exclusive strategy game. So over 2 million in 2012, and that's without a major release. And our player base is pretty engaged, right? So we've got an average mean play time across all players of about 90 hours. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the core pillars underlying the series, the common features of every Total War game. So the first one is obviously that unique defining feature of the series, right? The combination of the campaign and battle environments, the combination of turn-based and real-time experiences. And we believe that they add up to more than the sum of their parts, right? Each makes the other stronger. So the battles aren't standalone. You're emotionally invested. It might be a battle for the capital of your arch enemy. On the flip side, the real-time battles, they punctuate the campaign with adrenaline and reward. So you care more about the units in the campaign because you see them fighting for you in battle at a human level. So each obviously creates its own style of gameplay. There's a lot to say about the dynamical implications of turn-based versus real-time gameplay, but that's really a topic for a whole other day. But overall, I think the mix that we have of turn-based and real-time experience, I hope delivers the best of both worlds, really. Now, the second pillar I want to talk about is deep gameplay. Now, that's obviously a huge topic, but at the heart of gameplay is the rather simple notion of choices and trade-offs. I think it was at GDC last year that Sid Meier gave a talk where he defined gameplay as a series of interesting decisions, and that's absolutely spot on, and it's central to how we think about gameplay. The kernel of every great game is about presenting the player with compelling choices, each of which has certain pros and cons, right? Certain trade-offs with meaningful consequences. So decision counterpoint really is gameplay. Without it, there's no game. There's just an interactive experience. Now, I think that's pretty straightforward in a strategy game, where the decisions are clear and conscious. Do I build this building that lets me recruit this unit, or do I build that building that, I don't know, gives a defensive bonus to an existing army? Do I move my army into this region to cripple my enemy, or do I move it to that region to, I don't know, capture a particularly valuable gold mine? But the concept applies equally across genres, really. So good action gameplay is also about serving up choices with trade-offs. So in a racing game, when I approach a corner, where and when do I brake? Do I risk going around full speed? Do you overtake now, or do you wait for a safer opportunity? In a shooter, when an enemy appears, do you duck and run for cover, or do you take a shot? Right? Do you spend that extra split-second aiming? So although the pacing of the decisions and the context determines genre, gameplay in any genre is really about choosing. And of course, in many action games, really the choices are often more attentional. So there are certain things you just have to do, right? But the player, but not everything can be done at once. So the player has to prioritize, and that's where the choice comes in. So in some ways, the player's attention itself is the gameplay resource that a skilled player has to manage. Now, in a turn-based game, the clock is not ticking. So that means that turn-based games require really great design focus and care to ensure that all of the choices are really balanced and genuine, because the player has to make these choices very consciously and deliberately. And it's no coincidence, I think, that it was Sid Meier that's been pushing this point. And of course, the situation is crucial, right? The best choice in one situation can lead to disaster in another. So although this complicates the decision, it makes it more interesting. It makes it much deeper, because the value of each choice depends. It depends on the situation. It depends on how you play. It depends on the environment, on the enemy. It depends on the mission and the objective. So there's no globally correct choice of gun. So weak gameplay, right? Weak gameplay is generally due to weak counterpoint. So that's a poor balance between the pros and cons of the decisions that are offered up. Now, this might seem obvious, but many games effectively force a single optimal strategy on the player somewhere down the line. And when a decision is put before the player that has a right answer, then it's not really a decision at all. It's just a task to determine what that right answer is. So there's no gameplay. And that's actually how I would define micromanagement. Micromanagement is forcing the player to execute a series of right answers. So if you present the player with actions that are necessities rather than valid choices with real pros and cons, that's really dangerous. It replaces gameplay with effectively making the player run through this checklist, right? And as designers, we really need to seek and exterminate these false choices across the game. We need to remove them, or we need to balance the counterpoint. We need to get rid of that checklist problem. So, for example, do you build building X in a particular city? Well, why would you not do that? If there's no, apart from the cost, I mean, cost is obviously one factor, but if there's no reason why not, then it's just something to do. Now, sometimes that means that reducing the player's scope to act can actually make for better counterpoint. Because if they can't build every building in a city, then the value of each building choice is really magnified. And we're constantly looking at this within the design of Total War games, trying to improve the design as we make new games. So apart from changing the way that the building mechanics worked, I mean, another example is in original Rome, Total War, it was generally optimal to set your tax rate at the highest rate possible that the population would bear without rebelling, right? So what that meant was that because there was that optimal strategy, every turn you'd go around and around and make sure that your tax rate was set to that correct level. So in later games, we wanted to put in a stronger counterpoint, a stronger long-term economic penalty to higher tax rates and a stronger benefit to lower tax rates. And I'm not saying we did it perfectly, but the idea was to make the setting of the tax rate an active choice rather than an exercise in executing a right answer, rather than micromanagement. So anyway, what is the context of these decisions, right? What are these decisions fundamentally about? Well, in strategy games, I would argue, really, that the context of decision-making generally falls into two spaces, right? The first is positional or spatial, and the second is really system dynamics. So strategy players generally manage resources using stock and flow dynamics with interacting feedback loops. Now, I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but basically the dynamics here can get very, very complicated, right? Stock and flow and feedback loops create very complicated dynamics, but they add a huge amount of depth, and they're used surprisingly often. In strategy games, they are almost everywhere. They're ubiquitous. That's really the problem space that the player is navigating around. It's what the player's decisions are all about. So as designers, it's really critical that we understand the system dynamics in our games. We need to make sure that the dynamics behave in the way that we want. So look, when you manage resources in a strategy game, you generally have a stock of stuff, right? And you have a flow rate in and a flow rate out. So in Total War games, you have a treasury, and flowing in each turn you have income, and flowing out each turn you have troop upkeep. Now, you tend to use money from the treasury to build buildings to increase your income, and that's a positive feedback loop, increases your income. You also use money to recruit troops, right? Now, troops create more upkeep, and so that's a counterbalancing negative feedback loop. So generally, you have positive feedback loops very often in games where success makes you stronger, right? So you use troops to capture more regions, and with those regions, you can build more troops. You have more income to build more troops. That's a positive feedback loop where success makes you stronger. So that's generally balanced against negative feedback loops, counterbalancing negative feedback loops where success creates handicaps. So for instance, more troops means more upkeep, which means you've got less money for further troops. More regions creates more borders for you to defend, which means you need more troops. So the challenge generally increases. So positive feedback loops really form the core of most progression systems in games. You've got these increasing power. You've got increasing player power combined with increasing challenge. So the increasing power is counterbalanced by increasing challenge. So in many games, as I said, you'll have these mixed feedback loops. So, for example, another example in Total War, to use Total War as an example here, generally you'll have research capability that increases as you progress through the game, right? So it's a step function there because, for instance, you might be building universities that increase the speed at which you can research. But at the same time, you've got exponentially increasing research costs, right? Higher level techs take more to research. So the point here is that the dynamics can get pretty complicated and unpredictable. What is the outcome? How does player power progress through time in the presence of those competing positive and negative feedback loops? Well, what you need to do as a designer, what we all need to do is model them. We need to make sure that they're working as we intend. And if they are working as intended, well, congratulations. So, I mean, it's a challenge, right? So, the message that I'm trying to push underlying all of this is that we need to consciously design the dynamics that we want. We need to model the dynamics before they get coded up. We need to use Excel as a design tool, right? It can massively reduce the iterations that the coders have to go through. Now most of us do this to some extent, but we all need to do it systematically as a habit. And it's also useful to think, what would the AI do? Now, if we have no idea, then we probably haven't consciously designed the dynamics for gameplay. Of course, if the answer is a little bit too easy, then we need to make sure we haven't just made rails for an optimal strategy. So look, pushing this Excel modeling thing here is about more than just balance. It's more fundamental. It's about the dynamics that we're trying to create. It's about what exactly is the dynamic terrain that the player's navigating in our game with their choices. Now, this might seem overly reductive and mathematical, and obviously there's much more to making a fun, compelling experience. I feel like the guy at the party saying, what is the strategy for having fun? But you know, as game designers, we are the engineers of fun. And we have to know exactly what we're doing when we engineer the counterpoint. So we create the problem space that the player is exploring. And that problem space in strategy games consists of dynamic systems. That's the kernel of the game. So we need to map this terrain that we're making for the player. I mean, we wouldn't make a level, right, without having specific design objectives in each area. And the same is true for the dynamic space. So we can take a look at another little example. So we can plot how we want the success chance for an assassin, right? So this is a plot of the assassin's level versus the likelihood that they'll make a particular kill. Now, let's assume that the target remains the same. Let's say the target is a level 5 target, so in the middle there. So how do we want this to look? Maybe we want a linear curve. Maybe we want the success chance as the assassin improves to increase linearly like that. Maybe we want a diminishing return, so adding in sort of counterbalancing negative feedback. But what about this? What about having most of the gains in the middle of your dynamic range? Well, what does this mean? This means that if you're much better or much worse than your target, if the assassin is much better or much weaker than the target, then it doesn't really matter how much. But if the assassin and the target are similar levels, then if the system is very, very sensitive to variation, right? But we might want the opposite. We might want most of the gains at the extremes. And why might we want that? Well, we might want to really reward the first few level ups for the assassin, and we might want to reward maxing out the character. Now, you could talk for ages about the pros and cons of these different approaches, and there's no right answer. My point is that we need to think about exactly what we want, and we need to make it work as intended. And we can do that before it hits the code. So another example, we can plot unit cost against unit power. So it might look something like this, right? Now we could draw a line here and say that, well, units above the line are overpowered, so they're more powerful than their cost would suggest. And units below the line are underpowered, they're less powerful than their cost might suggest. But what do we actually want the curve to look like? I mean, you know, we might want a diminishing return. Maybe we want an increasing return. And why might we want that? Well, we want that because generally high-level units require other investments. They require high-level technologies, high-level buildings to build. So that's one reason why we might want an increasing return. But actually, there's a more important reason. If the curve's diminishing, then why wouldn't a rich player just build lots and lots of weaker units? Right? Because that would get them the most power onto the battlefield for each unit of money. So I'll say it just one more time. When we do this stuff, when we create our dynamic systems, we really need to be very conscious of what we're trying to do. We need to model the dynamics, and we need to really think about what we want. So look, I'm going to move on from system dynamics and talk about the third core pillar, which is historical accuracy. So we go to great lengths to make sure our historical settings are portrayed as authentically as possible in Total War. We want everything the player does to make them feel like a Japanese warlord or a medieval king or a Roman general. It's about delivering immersion, that suspension of disbelief that takes the game to the next level inside the player's head. So we don't see history like this at all. We see it like this or this. History inspires us. It gives us so much great content to put into the game. I mean, there's so much mad stuff in history that you absolutely just couldn't make up. And flaming pigs in battle is just one example. So, talking about historical accuracy, I just wanted to say a few words about realism and how we think about realism. So Total War games are realistic, definitely. Now, of course, you don't want to be too realistic. Otherwise, battles might last all day with breaks for tea and collecting your dead. No, it's not about that. It's about perceived realism. So, what this means is that tactics that work in the real world should work in the game, and that's absolutely key to that kind of realism. Is what keeps the game intuitive. So it means that realism has to be the servant of gameplay, not its master. So if we take the morale system in our battles as an example, so we model soldier psychology so that various factors can make men's morale break and they run away. That's the best picture I could find to represent morale. So morale is certainly realistic, right? I mean, real historical battles were not fought down to the last man. Even a winning army, even a losing army, would take only maybe 20 or 30% casualties. So battles really were all about morale. But realism is not why morale's in the game. It's in the game because it adds a huge amount of gameplay. It adds choices. Things like, do you chase down a routing unit that's running away, or do you concentrate on breaking the next unit? It adds a whole parallel form of attack and defense, of strength and weakness. It also makes how you use your general much more significant. It also avoids this sort of mopping up phase that you have at the end of the battle by forcing the losing army to rout. So you avoid this unnecessary chore. But the core point, the most important point about morale, is that it makes the battles not attritional. It's not about who brings the biggest army to the battlefield. And that's because you can use morale to break enemy units, even if you've got fewer units, as long as you play wisely. Now, of course, there's obviously also the kind of combination gameplay of matching the right units against the right target, but morale adds this whole other layer of gameplay, of choices and trade-offs and consequences, and it allows you to beat a much larger army. So, to continue on the subject of realism, it kind of follows on nicely. I want to say a few words about the nature of simulation. And I'm going to do that in the context of the third generation of Total War games, because direct fire weapons really make these issues much more obvious. In 2009, we released Empire Total War, and that was based on a brand new engine, so all the code was written from scratch, which made it a very, very challenging development project. Now, set in the 18th century, it introduced naval battles and a focus on direct fire weapons. And it was really the first time that we tackled gunpowder warfare. And then we had Napoleon that kind of matured the engine. But these direct fire weapons really kind of highlighted some of the issues around simulation. So this is how these games look. Again, we've got no audio. He's trying, but it's just not there. So you can see, this is very much a game fundamentally based on massed gunpowder warfare. So you've got direct fire weapons that shoot in a straight line. And it gives an introduction to how we think about simulation. Damn this audio. Okay. Lots of explosions. I should probably go boom, bam, pow. Okay, so as I said, in our engine, we simulate every bullet, right? Every cannonball on the battlefield, and that's actually hundreds of thousands of projectiles in each battle. Now, in a traditional RTS paradigm, Rules tend to determine the kill rate, right? You use a rule-based system. So in this situation, the kill rate might be 50%. So with these particular units at this particular range, you might have a rule that says, okay, the kill rate's 50%. Now, if a target's in cover, you'll apply a rule. Say you might halve the kill rate. So you might do a line of sight check to make sure that those two units there can actually, the ones that have been chosen to be killed, can actually be hit. But fundamentally, it's a rules-driven system. Simulation, on the other hand, means that you're modeling every projectile. And that means that it's actually the ballistics themselves that determine the kill rate. And that means that the effect of cover is entirely dependent. It's entirely dependent on exactly where and how the men are standing and on the nature of the intervening geometry. And as designers, that's really, really scary, right? Because it means we're not totally in control. But what it does mean is that certain properties of real warfare, of real battles, naturally emerge from the simulation without us actually having to create lots of special case rules for each situation. So, for example, different formations present different targets. So in the column on the left here, the men in the front each take multiple bullets, right? And so they shield the men behind from attack. Whereas on the right, the entire line is exposed to fire. And this just falls naturally out of simulating every bullet. We don't need a special rule like column formation gives you a plus 30% defense against gunfire. It's just a property of the simulation. And similarly, elevation just falls out naturally and becomes powerful because it exposes the entire unit, the men behind, to line of sight. Similarly, in naval warfare, a good admiral would always try to shoot the enemy ship in the rear, right? That's called raking fire. So what that was all about, in a side-on situation, the cannonball goes through the shortest cross-section of the ship and it only kills a few men, right? But a shot in the rear means that the cannonball can plow through the entire length of the ship with devastating effect. And again, we don't need a special rule for this. It's just a naturally emergent property of the simulation because the simulated cannonballs fly along through the ship, killing all the crew in their path. And of course, each crew member and each gun inside the ship is fully simulated and destructible. But sometimes the properties of the simulation can actually be dangerous to gameplay. So one example, during the development of Empire, we found that shooting an enemy ship from long range was actually more likely to sink it than blasting it from close range. So that seemed pretty counterintuitive. So what was actually going on? Well, at close range, shots traveled horizontally through the target ship, whereas at long range, the cannonballs had a dipping trajectory by the end of it, right? So they were coming downwards towards the target, so when they hit, they were much more likely to do damage below the waterline and sink the ship. Now, we could say that's realistic and go with it, but it's tricky because it can make for confusing behavior in the system. And it's an interesting debate to be had, how to deal with these things. I think we ended up just actually adding bonuses for close range fire, so we had a range effect. But the point is that sometimes the properties of the simulation can actually make things dangerous. You have to control it and be very aware with what's going on. So if we have a look at some of that in game, just very briefly, this is the column formation there. So you can see just the men at the front are actually able to be hit quite effectively, though. Whereas in the line formation, you've got the whole line exposed to fire. But unfortunately, that firing unit doesn't seem to be doing such a good job there. And here you've got the forts, which have a huge cover effect. It makes these guys at the top extremely hard to hit, whereas the guys below are much easier to hit. Obviously, you've got every man exposed to fire rather than just the sort of top of the head of the guy at the front. And in naval battles, you've got, as I said, close-up firing. They travel right through the ship. Here's some raking fire, so you've got the cannonballs plowing right through the entire ship. Some long-range fire. I mean, because of the velocities, the dipping wasn't too severe, but it was definitely noticeable before we made any changes to it. Okay. So Here's a summary of some of our adventures with simulation. I think we feel that it can be surprisingly beneficial, but the main learning is you've got to be very careful. The worst thing that can happen is that you need to create loads of gamey rules in order to mitigate against the unintended properties of the simulation, a simulation which you used in order to avoid the need for gamey rules in the first place. So we've got to be really careful. Now, of course, the impact of all of this on game balancing is especially important, of course, for multiplayer. And I think it's fair to say that Total War games have really been designed in the first instance as single-player experiences. For a start, the campaign map timescale is epic. It takes days and days of solid gameplay to actually finish a campaign. And the battles are all about controlling big armies, so they're really all about these epic 1v1 encounters. Now, of course, I want to emphasize we do and we will continue to support this core multiplayer experience. And Rome 2 absolutely will come with 1v1 and co-op multiplayer campaigns and 1v1 up to 4v4 multiplayer battles with all the trimmings. But we also want to take Total War multiplayer to the next level. And we need to do this with a new game that is exclusively designed, exclusively made for multiplayer. And that game I want to announce here right now for the first time is called Total War Arena. There it is. Okay, thank you. Yes, we're pretty excited about it as well. So what exactly is it? Well, Arena is Total War's multiplayer online battle arena. Now, let me outline some of the details first before we get caught up in genre labeling. So what is it? Well, in Arena, we have up to 10v10 team-based battles. Each player controls just 3 units, a squad of just 3 units, so a max of 500 men. So you have this epic clash of armies, each with thousands of men, but each player will have to have their own role in battle, right? One player might focus on archers, ranged attacks, another on tanking defense. But to win, this army of players has to unite and they have to cooperate. So archers will need to support the assault troops. Cavalry or spearmen will need to protect the archers from harassment. So players control 3 units rather than the usual 20. And that really means a tighter, closer, more action-oriented design philosophy. And around these battles, we have this really compelling progression wrapper with an absolutely huge array of content. So you start small, using the rewards that you earn in battle, you upgrade your generals, your units, and the items that they bring into battle. Now, I deliberately call this a multiplayer online battle arena game, but it's not any kind of Dota or League of Legends clone, which seems to be what the MOBA genre has come to mean. Others would call this an MMO, and it is that. I mean, we definitely want to reach an audience greater than the 2 to 3 million core Total War players that we have. I mean, a huge active player base really is the lifeblood of a successful multiplayer service. And so Arena will be free to play. So it's quite a big deal for us, yes. It's a very big deal for us. So look, I just want to say one thing about our kind of monetization philosophy. If you look at the core game loop, you fight battles, you earn rewards from those battles which you use to upgrade your army. Now, any of these stages could be monetized, right? We could have premium upgrades, we could have premium advantages in battle, but our focus really is going to be all about that. It's going to be all about enhancing rewards. So we want to focus on accelerators that allow faster progression up through the content. We want the vast majority of content to be available to all players free if they earn it. And we want well-balanced, exciting battles that have no free-to-play distortions, right? That's our goal. So we want to focus on rewards. So why exactly are we doing this? Why exactly this game? Why Arena? Well, as I said, we want to take Total War multiplayer to the next level. We absolutely want truly compelling, accessible, immediately engaging multiplayer gameplay. And to do this requires us to move beyond just the it requires us to move beyond the multiplayer experience of core Total War games, which were primarily designed as these epic single-player experiences. We want team-based gameplay. We want players to perform a mix of battlefield roles. We believe this allows for stronger gameplay, more interesting choices for each player, and it provides a much richer variety of experience. I should also say, playing in a team of 10 is a lot less intimidating than a 1v1 experience for new players. I mean, you don't always want to invest full 15 minutes with one stranger on the internet. Or maybe some of us do, but anyway, as I said before, a thriving multiplayer game needs a thriving, active multiplayer community. And balanced matchmaking, of course, which we absolutely need. Balanced matchmaking needs as many players as it can get. So we want a really big player population, and that's really the core reason that Arena is going to be free to play. Now, of course, look, it would be phony of me to stand here and pretend to ignore the commercial appeal of free-to-play as a business model, but really commercial success with free-to-play is entirely dependent on engaging players with great fun gameplay. I mean, a free-to-play game really lives or dies on engagement, on delivering fun. And of course, we need a really compelling progression and skill curve with really great early gameplay where your very first battle is immediately engaging and accessible. And not only that, but we need to make sure that the upgrades that you're grinding through, they need to give really genuine improved capability, but they also need to be really tangible. So we really want you to feel the difference, even in the way that the soldiers handle. Otherwise, the grinding loop just won't be fun. Now, all this requires a new game. It requires a new game made for multiplayer, and that is why we are making Arena. So how are we doing it? Well, I should say that while the core Total War team, the big Total War team that we have, has been working really hard to deliver Rome 2, we've had a small, separate, but super talented team working away in the background on Arena for almost a year now. Now, obviously, developing a free-to-play service like Arena comes with a host of challenges to overcome. I mean, there's the technical challenges of making a scalable online infrastructure. There's obviously a host of operational challenges too, but I'm not really here to lecture you guys on all of that. I want to focus on the fundamental design challenge that we face when we adapt Total War battles for a 10v10 free-to-play multiplayer game. So, if we deconstruct Total War battle gameplay in terms of what the player actually does, we can look at it segmented by time blocks. So on the scale of an entire session, say an hour or more, the gameplay consists of the progression game outside of battles. Now in core Total War, that's the campaign map, but in Arena, this is the progression wrapper, right? The meta game where you customize and improve your units and your generals. On the minute-to-minute scale, so that's fine, right? On the minute-to-minute scale, the core battlefield gameplay is really all about maneuver. It's about jostling for position. So you move to take a hill, or you respond to an enemy flanking maneuver. So these kinds of battle dynamics are similar in core Total War and in Arena. It's just that in Arena you have to cooperate with other team members to win. So I think that's so far so good. I think it's pretty clear that from a design perspective, the elephant in the room really is the second-to-second gameplay. Here we have a problem to solve, right? And that's because in core Total War, the player can control 20 units, whereas in Arena, the player controls just 3. Now in core Total War, wielding those 20 units, say 4,000 men, that takes a lot of skill and expertise. It's a lot of management, mobilizing different groups of units to perform different roles on the battlefield. You know, you've got to identify weak points. You've got to find the best way to counter enemy moves across multiple lines. And in Arena, we want to make sure that it takes just as much skill to wield your 3-unit squad as it takes to manage your army of 20 units in core Total War. Because we want Arena to be just as active and skill-based. I mean, it absolutely has to be. So in core Total War, an expert can actually destroy a single player, An expert can destroy an inexperienced player in, certainly with 20 units at hand. But with 3 units, there are far fewer degrees of freedom, right? So actually the fight can get pretty close, and we have to change all that for Arena, right? And that's not simple. It means some fundamental changes to the combat mechanics. It means things that are passive or automated in core Total War must become active and skilled in Arena. We can't have passive gameplay. It absolutely has to be active. And we're experimenting with lots of different things here, such as manual controlled charges, manual archer fire, even manual aiming, MOBA-style special abilities to really drive active, skilled gameplay. Now, core Total War is not a crazy high APM game, but we definitely need Arena to have at least a comparable number of actions per minute for a skilled player. Not only this, but we need to make sure that the stats framework underlying all this, underpinning the combat system, can actually support the extensive and tangible progression that the player has to feel as they upgrade their units. Now, in some ways, the simulation elements that I touched on earlier can actually help us out, right? Because they give us a rich framework for deep and emergent gameplay. But we need to be really careful because we need control and balance more than ever in a free-to-play multiplayer game like Arena, where balanced, meaningful, but measured power upgrades are absolutely critical. And one part of this story is how combat damage works. So damage actually can help enhance the depth of our simulation at the same time as actually helping us to control it. So I'll say a few words about that. So in previous Total War games, we've never really used hit points. Certainly not as a core part of the combat system. In general, each soldier had just 1 hit point, so he was either alive or he was dead. And that means it's easy to see a unit's overall health at a glance. No stats, no numbers. So this unit has 20 men, it's got 20 hit points. This unit has 12 men, it has 12 hit points. You can see the difference. Now, most other games have far fewer entities, but these larger entities can take and remember damage. And one interesting side effect of this is actually that in most games, as one of these larger entities, as their health diminishes, they can still dish out the same DPS. They can dish out the same damage per second. They're just as good at dealing damage as they take damage. However, for us, as a unit loses men, it actually loses attacking entities, so its damage output is reduced. Now, in a 1v1 battle, that's okay. It creates a positive feedback loop. It's kind of an extra reward for kills. But in Arena, where you only have 3 units, this becomes an issue. And that's especially because melee combat, in particular, is generally paired, right? You have to be in a fight with somebody to actually do damage to them. So to deal damage, you almost inevitably receive some damage as well. Now, that's very different from shooting at a distance, right? So unit A can shoot at B without B shooting at A. Melee is very different. So if we introduce damage into our combat system, what that means is that each man here, each one of these lots of little men, each one of them has hit points. And it means that the units can tank damage without an automatic DPS reduction, without losing their ability to deal damage. But introducing damage actually has an even more important consequence. So our units are complicated things, right? They're compound objects made up of many men. And if you add per man damage, you add a hell of a lot of information into the system. So a damaged unit can look like this, or it can look like this, or it can look like this. So that's the same unit, but very different tactical implications. So if you attack from the wrong direction, you hit fresh troops and you don't reduce the target's damage dealing capability. You attack from the right direction and you can reduce the enemy's damage dealing capability pretty quickly. This kind of thing really can help add the depth we need for 3-unit control. It gives the expert an angle for winning, even with a small number of units. And it definitely makes victory harder to master without actually making the game any harder to play. Because a noob can not worry about these things and just not be quite so effective. So it's important to add that damage also gives us a very controllable and defined stats framework with which to control power. certainly the power of different units. It massively helps us balance things out, even as we embrace the additional depth that it gives. Now, some of you may have spotted the idea that saying number of men equals damage output for one of our units is actually a bit of an oversimplification. And that's right, it's a lot more complicated than that because of battle formations. So not every man can actually get in combat with every other man. Not every man can actually reach an enemy soldier. And because melee combat is generally in pairs, that means the number of men in combat drives DPS received as well as DPS dished out. So this disciplined pattern here could really be seen as a kind of defensive pattern. It's a defensive combat. You've got low DPS on both sides there because you've got very few men in combat dishing out and receiving damage. Alternatively, blue here can move. It can circle the enemy and spread itself around. Now, this is a much more offensive formation, right? You've got more men in combat, so it deals more damage, and also both units can deal and receive more damage because there are a lot more combat pairs. Of course, the real trick is to get multiple entities onto a single enemy entity, like you see at the corners there. So, look, here we've got this incredibly rich battle engine which models the behavior of thousands of men, and even with 3 units, you control, maybe 500 men. So they all make combat attacks on their targets when they can get into contact. So we've got soldier-level damage, which makes units strong or weak in different places. And we've got a combat system that's very sensitive to the simulation of individual fighting formations. So in core Total War, the player controls each unit as a block, right? So the behavior of individual men is completely automated. So given all of that, and given the depth that we can get with these individual men, I think there's just one thing we had to try, and I just briefly want to show it to you. But I want to emphasize that this is not Arena itself, what I'm going to show you. This is not even something we're sure of. This is a prototype of the kind of thing that we are trying out in the battle engine to solve this core design challenge of taking a game with 20 units and making it deeper and richer with just 3 units. So if we take a quick look at that. So that is a very big deal for us. We're basically looking at breaking down the boundaries of what defines a unit and giving the player much closer, more direct control. Now, of course, we think the possibilities here are huge, but many perils will lie ahead. But what you can actually see here is individual drag and drop control over every single individual soldier. So a skilled player can really micro each warrior here and manage exactly how and where to attack the enemy. Now, this is just a test bed, and obviously we've got a lot to do to get this playing right, but we really, really see potential in this approach. It definitely gives us some of the ammunition we need to make Arena all about skill. So yeah, you can see the player there, individual control over each entity there. So you can control exactly how you make your attacks. We'll see exactly what we do in the end. We're still experimenting. So look, making this game is it's a huge adventure for us. As I said, we're experimenting with a lot of different things. We're learning loads every day. All I really want to say is that I really very much hope that I can stand up here at a future GDC and tell you all about how Arena has been a great success. But there's absolutely a lot of blood, sweat, and tears between now and that day. And with that thought, I'll finish up and say thank you very much. So I think we've got a bit of time for a couple of questions, if people have any. Don't know if we've got anybody managing them, but...
Hi. So Arena sounds amazing. I was wondering if you're going to implement like a chain of command system, so like one player would be like an army general, or maybe you'd have one commanding like a wing, so he'd have 3 players under his command, something like that.
Well, what I would say is what we're doing first is we're really trying to make sure that we get the core of the gameplay absolutely great. And then obviously what we're going to do is, we keep supporting Arena after it's beated, after it's released. So we absolutely will look to add different things as we go. But in terms of the very core experience that we want to create, the real focus is on creating the kind of individual battlefield roles, and we're still experimenting with exactly how those roles will look and what those roles would be. And so I wouldn't want to predict any specific role right now.
Okay, great, thanks.
Cheers.
Two things. First of all, is there any particular time period that you have in mind for Total War Arena?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think ultimately we see Arena as something where we can pitch commanders from across history against each other. So we're not looking to fix Arena in a specific time period. That's one of the fun things about doing it is we can actually eventually have a whole sweep of different historical periods. But that again is something that we'll look to be releasing new content constantly after launch, because it's going to be an ongoing service. But no, that's a good question.
Okay. And then the second one is the commander unit has always been particularly important, as you mentioned, for morale and stuff. So would each player have their own general, or would it be more one person has to invest in the general and then use that to help out his allies in terms of morale and stuff? Yeah,
we are right now looking at each player having their own special character that forms the kind of hook for their squad of 3 units. So yes, each player, that's what we're looking at right now.
Hey, so first I wanted to mention thank you and being a proponent of that, because that's extremely important. My actual question is, have you given any thought to modeling individual damage? You're talking about adding hit points.
Sorry, modeling individual?
Modeling individual damage. For example, if I strike someone, if a unit chooses to strike someone towards the upper body versus lower body, I'm talking about modeling the effects of damage versus just a number hit point system. I'm curious if you've toyed with that at all.
Yeah, I mean, certainly that's an interesting idea. I mean, one thing I would say is that what Total War has is because we've got thousands and thousands of soldiers, we've got this real sort of statistical scale. And that's why we didn't really feel that we needed hit points before. We felt that really our combat system worked on a kind of chance to hit basis, right? Which works because you've got so many troops. So a 10% increase in the chance to hit in combat is roughly similar to saying a 10% increase in the damage that you do across hundreds of units. So I think the first step for us, the big step, is to actually have damage on a per man basis, and that gives the additional depth that I've been talking about. But adding further complication to that, I think that would be a great thing to do in a game which is more about a much smaller number of entities. But for us, I don't think we need that yet. But never say never. Who knows what we might end up doing? But certainly in terms of modeling that, I think it is important to again push that mathematical thing and be a proponent of modeling. But where it gets a bit, you can take it too far and actually make the modeling tools almost as complicated as the code itself. So there's definitely a time when you may as well just try it out in the code. Sure. But we certainly do mathematically model the damage systems in a simple situation with a pair of entities fighting each other to look at the different curves and to see how the damage systems work out. But we don't actually model the kind of spatial dynamics offline. That's something that we need to do in the combat system.
Do you have something to where a unit who's at 10% of their total health, for example, has a different combat effectiveness than a unit that is at 100%?
Well, what's interesting is that when you've got per man damage, that depends, right? So a unit that is at 50% health, say you've got 100 men in a unit that's at 50% health, it could have 50 men. Or it could have 100 men, each at 50% health. That's what gives you that depth, introducing damage. But it's, as I said, it's something that we shied away from in the past because we had a statistical scale not to need it. And we were always resistant to losing that immediate clarity of 50 guys, 50 hit points.
Cool, thank you.
Okay.
So I was curious about how you mentioned having the battles be 10 versus 10 player sort of matches. Now, are you sort of going in the are you guys going in the direction more of where teams working with each other and coordinating their actions very well will be really important, or to the point where, say, a poorly managed team would would like sort of fall apart, or would it be more of sort of a pickup game kind of thing where even if you're not necessarily constantly, barking out orders to your allies, you would still be able to have a fairly fun game at even a sort of a casual level?
Yeah, look, that's a great question, and really, you're asking about how powerful is cooperation, and I think we're still working that out now. We could make it too powerful, right? So, for instance, if you had a unit where you just had archers, but you'd be completely wiped out if just one weak cavalry unit came near you, that would make cooperation extremely critical, and you'd be in real trouble if you weren't a perfectly honed organization. I think for us, it's really a question of balance, right? We definitely want cooperation to be critical. But we don't want a situation where, if one guy in your army, one guy in your group of 10 decides to do something else, everything's lost, right? It's a matter of balance, and we're still looking at exactly how to do that. It may be that we make cooperation more important as you progress, so that in higher level battles, maybe cooperation is a little bit more important. Whereas, for brand new players, it's not so critical. We're still looking at these things, but it's a great question because it is a very important thing to get right. Yeah, how important is cooperation? You don't want it to be too powerful, and you don't want it to not mean enough.
Yeah, one thing I would look at is I think League of Legends handled that very well, where the different sort of gameplay modes sort of offered sort of those sort of a stratification of you could either jump into Dominion, where it's pretty much all casual, you can just screw around and do fairly well, versus highly competitive play.
I mean, I think a big difference is that in those kinds of games, you're with your group for a long period of time, right? And you've got a small number.
Right.
Whereas for us, arena battles, we want them to last, maybe 10 minutes. So we want a quick experience. So cooperation is important, but it's not absolutely everything, right? That's the thing. It's a matter of balance, but that's a good question.
Okay. I was watching the video there, and I saw that the player would have control over every single individual unit. Have you guys considered the fact that realistically, a general could only really give commands to commanders of individual units?
Sorry, say that again. Where generals can?
And realistically, generals can only give commands to captains or commanders. They can't give commands to every single individual unit, and how that might affect gameplay.
Okay, well, first of all, I should emphasize that, so you saw control there over every individual guy, right? Every individual man. That's not necessarily, that's just a demonstration of what the kinds of things we're trying and what we can do. That's not necessarily exactly how it will end up in the game. We might do it in a slightly different way. But in terms of, realism and what generals can do, I mean, there has always in total been a slight abstraction. We want the player to feel like they're the general, but at the same time they have instant control over all the units in their battlefield. But I think that's just it's something for us to look at exactly how generals control, exactly what generals do and how they control their armies. I'm not quite sure exactly what you're kind of proposing. If you're saying that you can only
in the Total War games, I thought it's an important part of the gameplay was the kind of disconnect that you had with the battle itself. You kind of had to let it play out in a certain respect. You don't have control over everything, and that was what was interesting about it. You only had control over initial actions, initial sequences,
Yeah, I mean, it's true that in Core Total War, we want you to feel like a general controlling an army, so you've got these 20 units, that's the level of your control. But in Arena, it's really about you controlling 3 units, so it's a different experience. You're kind of closer to them. You're more like the Centurion, in this example, the Centurion controlling these 3 units, or you're the leader, you're the Sergeant Major controlling that smaller group. So it's not quite the same experience. So I think it certainly feels valid to give you tighter control over the men inside those 3 units, because you haven't got control of such a big group.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I've got a pretty boring question. What are your plans for monetization?
Sorry?
What are your plans for monetization?
Well, like I said, our fundamental focus, we really want it to be on enhancing the rewards that the player earns from each battle. We don't want to have pay-to-win distortions in battle, and we don't really want to, we don't really want to block off big areas of content to premium-only users. I think, our goal is to make the vast majority of content available to everybody, and so that's our main focus is on enhancing the rewards that players earn from battle.
What kind of rewards are you planning for players to get?
Well, we're looking at different things. I mean, obviously, we'll have virtual currencies. We'll have experience. We want you to have to level up your units. We'll want you to have to earn virtual currency with which you can buy. I mean, soft currency that you earn in game that you can use to buy items and better units, and you get experience for your leaders, so you can help them level up. They get new abilities, that kind of thing.
Cool. Thanks.
Cheers. Okay.
I had a question about the melee in the previous Total Wars. Like, I know I would be in a battle, and I have 500 men surrounding one, and only one guy could get at the one at a time. I was wondering if you were planning on making it so ganging up is more important, like 5 guys can take on one.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely critical to be able to have multiple entities attacking one, and it's an absolutely core thing that the engine needs, both in single player actually as well as in multiplayer. So yes, absolutely, that's important. So yes, that is in the game.
Thanks.
Okay. All right. Is there one more question? Okay.
If you're going to have persistent experience and then also damage, that begs the question as to how persistent damage will be, say, after a battle, or if a unit is wiped out, do you lose that experience? And sort of how do you heal your units if they've taken damage?
That's an interesting question. At the moment we're not looking at healing. We may. We want to make sure that you go into each battle fresh, right? But the actual nature of how damage is healed, the very specifics, we're still looking at that. We're still working that out.
And then, in terms of like death, would death be permanent for a unit if you had a high-level unit that got wiped out?
Oh, okay. So right. So your question is, if you lose a unit in a battle in arena, have you lost that unit outside of that battle? So it's gone forever? No. You absolutely get your unit back. We want you to be forming a relationship with the squad as you improve it, as your leader progresses, as your troops get better, as you buy items for them. So there's no permadeath if you lose one of them in battles. Absolutely not.
Thank you.
Okay, maybe one more. All right.
One of the things that I've really enjoyed about playing Total War games over the years has been with every iteration they've had your troops have been more and more responsive. Back from the old Sprite days, the Rome Total War to medieval. What are some of the things, I guess, with Rome 2 y'all are working on at the per unit level and the per individual level, to help boost the realism of the combat system?
That's a good question. I mean, there's a lot of intricate work that goes into, making the combat look convincing. I mean, even in Rome 2, we're doing a lot to change the combat system and really improve it and make it feel more kind of visceral, make it look more compelling at that human level. We have to really carefully look at things like mass and collisions, and when units are charging in. Well, how does that look? How do the momentum collisions work? Do you knock guys over? What kind of damage does that do to them? We also, obviously making the animation system really, that's getting improved. That's getting improved a lot. So there's a lot more sort of tit for tat combat where there's a lot of to and fro, and it's all about just making these incremental improvements to the way the game engine performs. And in terms of responsiveness, it's actually about making. We want to really make handling differences between the soldiers, right? If you've got a really heavy infantry unit, you don't want it to instantly start moving in exactly the same way as a light unit, right? We've got to have these kind of acceleration parameters that make it feel like a heavy unit, and there's just a lot of tuning that goes into all of that stuff. But absolutely, we have to get this one-to-many combat just right as well, right? Where you've got multiple entities on one, and that is a challenge.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks again, guys, and I hope you enjoyed it. Cheers.